Good evening, and welcome to Majors and Quinn. My name is Sarah, and I'm one of the booksellers here. Thank you so much for coming in tonight. I'm so pleased you're joining us to celebrate David Hakensen's new book, Her Place in the Woods, The Life of Helen Hoover. A few housekeeping things before we get on with the show tonight. You will hear from David, and then there will be a time at the end of the program for any audience questions. After your Q&A, please allow David to move to the signing counter, which is the glass display case you saw on your way in and grabbed a book from. You may line up there to say hello and get a signed copy of the book tonight. If you do buy a book here this evening, you're not only supporting David, but you're also supporting a locally owned independent bookstore, and we cannot thank you enough, so thank you. Please allow me to introduce our guest. David Hakensen is a public relations executive with more than 40 years of experience. He has served on several nonprofit boards, and he was board president of the Minnesota Historical Society from 2018 to 2023. You can hear my accent very well right now. Please join me in welcoming David Hakensen.
Well, good evening. It's nice to see so many of you here and so many people that I know. So, can you hear okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm giving you the short version of my 1-hour PowerPoint presentation, which I know sounds horrible, but actually I've done it 3 times now, and it goes really fast and it's very engaging. I'm not trying to brag, but it actually works out well, and we've had a lot of questions. So a lot of people have been coming out to support me. This is the first time in the Twin Cities that I'm speaking. I've been at Chickawauk Museum, I was at the Grand Marais Library last week, and then I was at UMD a couple weeks ago. So that's where I did a lot of the research for the book, so that's why they got first dibs on me up there. And then I will be at the Minnesota History Center in conversation with Annette Atkins, who some of you may know. She's a retired history professor at St. Ben's University and wrote a very cool book about an alternative history of Minnesota called Creating Minnesota that she published 20 years ago. And she and I are going to have a conversation about Helen. And if you know Annette, she's very pointed in her questions and likes to stir things up. So I am expecting quite an interesting evening and conversation with Annette. So, but tonight I'm going to talk about the book. Many of you that know me have heard me talk about this project seemingly forever and kind of wondering, is this thing for real, or is he just like talking about it? But it's for real, and as you know, it's out there, and here it is, and I'm really excited about it. It's been received very well by critics so far, and people that are interested in Helen Hoover and nature writing and all those sort of things. So it's been a lot of fun to see that she's getting the sort of attention and recognition that she deserves. So, who is this Helen Hoover that I wrote about, and why does she matter? I think it's important to understand that she was a nature writer in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. She moved to Gunflint Lake in 1954 with her husband. They were going to live there permanently, and they had no prior experience living in the wilderness other than having visited their cabin for 6 previous summers. So when she got there, they figured out a career path, and I will talk about that in a little bit. And she ended up writing 4 best-selling nature books in the 60s and 70s, and 3 books that were really popular with children. But why does she still matter, and why is she relevant to today? Nature writing is timeless. We still read Walden, and what was that, 175 years ago? And if you read nature, you don't really get a sense of time if it's written well. You just get a sense of whatever the person is writing about, if it's animals or adventure or canoe paddling or any number of things. It just doesn't age that much. And Helen's writing really hasn't aged either, and that's why I was partially attracted to it when I was first reading it, is that it's very well written, it's different. It's not a Sigurd Olson type outdoor writing, which is about paddling and adventure, or Kelvin Rutstrom, who is another guy who did that sort of thing. Hers are more about her writing is more about things that she saw immediately around the cabin that she lived at with her husband, and she was able to take very simple things and very sort of mundane observations and turn them into really well-written stories about animals and things that she saw around her cabin. So if you read her today, and there's my book that tells you about her, but there's all of her books are still in print thanks to the University of Minnesota Press. They reprinted her 4 adult books and one of her children's books, and they're all available. So you can easily go back and get her work and read it again. So much of what older nature writers are out of print, and it's very hard to find the books. So not the case with Helen Hoover's books. So let's talk a little bit about her and her early years and how she gets to Gunflint Lake. Because when I started to write the book, I was more interested in her writing career. As I got into learning more about her as a person, she had this entire other career that came before writing that was fascinating, and it really needed to be told because it represents a woman who was in an industry that was not for women. So she was a trailblazer in that regard, and she was very talented in this field and really didn't get the recognition back in the 1950s that she would have probably gotten today had she done the things that she did today, that she did then. So she's born in Greenfield, Ohio, born to a prominent family in town. Her dad was a factory manager. Her father was 53 when she was born, and her mother was 38. And this is in 1910, so that's unusual to have that kind of a range of ages, particularly between husband and wife, but just to have children that late in life. With that sort of age, they definitely were people that came of age in the Victorian era. And her father doted on her. Her mother was very strict about her. She was an only child. She was expected to learn piano, ballet, be involved in all the things in high school that you'd expect somebody who's being pushed by their mother to do. So she liked to read, and she liked mysteries in particular. She didn't like to play outdoors. So she was a bookworm. She was somebody who did a lot of reading, was highly, had a very high IQ, although back then they didn't test for it, but it comes through in a lot of correspondence that I read where she talks about the fact that she had a high IQ and a high, I wouldn't say a genius, but she clearly was very smart for her age, and this comes through later in life with some of the things that she accomplishes. Her mother was very overbearing on her, and that also followed Helen through her life, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, and really made Helen that much more excited to go off to college when she went to Ohio University. And she was expected to study what women study. She studied English and classics, and probably was going to prepare for a career as a teacher, because this is the late 1920s. At the end of her freshman year, she comes home for summer vacation, and her father gets a phone call one night, and this is 1928 when the stock markets were starting to have a lot of problems. It wasn't the crash yet, but the markets were going like this through 27 and 28, and he lost all of his investments. And the next morning he woke up and he was going to go to Cincinnati to meet his broker and try to sort things out. He had a massive heart attack and died. So Helen and her mother Hannah were now, Hannah's a widow, and they have no plans for what to do next. Find out they have no money other than a year's worth of college for Helen to go back to Ohio. And once that happens, they're going to sort it out. Helen goes back. She has an advisor who's very smart, recognized that Helen was wasting her time on classics and English, and said you should study science and biology, chemistry, things like that, because you're much more adept at understanding those concepts than you are wasting your time on English and writing. So interesting. She still loved to write, but she took his advice, and really for the 1 year that she was able to spend a lot of time on science and chemistry and things like that. So when she gets back, she and her mother have this huge fight about what's going to happen next. Helen's mother, Hannah, had 4 other siblings. They lived in Cincinnati, and they all lived in one house together, and they were either all widowed or never married. So Helen said, I'm not moving to Cincinnati, which would have meant she probably would have had to have been a secretary or something. And she was going to Chicago. So her mother, being overprotective and overbearing, followed her to Chicago, and they literally had very little. I mean, they lived in the Y. They stayed in the Y the first night after they got off the train. They had no belongings other than their clothes. They rented a series of flea bag apartments that were furnished. Helen found some work, menial tasks here and there. Again, remember, this is the Depression. There's not a lot of hiring going on, and the beginning of the Depression. And she finally lands a job proofreading. So some of my former colleagues here will appreciate that. So she was working for the Audit Bureau of Circulations in this job where she had to read page after page of, ledger lines and for not only for the math to add up, but also for all the words to be perfect. So it was a really intense job that she had, but she was really good at it. Again, this is where her IQ and her adaptability came through, and she excelled, and they kept giving her more work to do, and she never said no. So she was getting paid overtime, and that obviously led to them being able to move up in their station in life and get better apartments. The thing that helped them was as things were getting worse in Chicago, better apartments became available, and Helen and her mother were able to move into a series of better apartments. In 1931, she starts dating an art director, a guy named Adrian. We'll talk about him later, but he ended up later in life illustrating all of her books. They went to this place in western Illinois called White Pines State Park. Some of you might have heard of it. It's the farthest south in the United States where there's still old growth white pine. So it hasn't been cut down. I've been there, it's beautiful. It looks like northern Minnesota in the middle of like farmland. It's unusual that there's this massive area of white pine and it's surrounded by farmland. And so you drive into it and you kind of go, wow, I don't think I'm in Illinois anymore. So, but it's beautiful, and that's where Adrian proposed to her. And they made a pact, sort of, that someday they wanted to live in the woods together. So that was sort of when the idea was sort of fated to happen. They eventually got married in 1937. Abe moved in with Helen and her mother, so they had a lovely little marriage with mom living there. And it did not go well, but they got along because that's what you did back then. So there wasn't going to be any opportunity for Helen to tell her mother to go get her own apartment. That was not an option. So they lived together as husband and wife and mother from 1937 until the 50s. At that same time, because they were both working, they decided they wanted to find their own cabin or a piece of land up north. And to them, that was northern Wisconsin or the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. And they went looking all over the place. And if any of you know much about northern Wisconsin, a good chunk of the beautiful old growth pine is all national forest. So it's not available. You can't buy it. You can't do anything with it other than enjoy it. So they eventually gave up. I mean, they were getting frustrated and they couldn't find anything. And then, of course, World War II comes along, and that changes everything for them. Abe enlists in the Navy. He goes off into the South Pacific. As many of you know, a lot of the jobs that men did in World War II were suddenly needed to be filled by people as the men went off to war. So women took a lot of those jobs. Of course, we all hear about Rosie the Riveter. She's the most sort of common example of women taking a traditional man's job. But there were all these other jobs that had to be filled. And Helen gravitated toward doing lab work, and she was got hired, and she took some night courses to brush up on some of her skills. And she got a job at a testing lab where she was testing metals, steel. And what that entailed was taking cuttings of different kind of metal, and you put them under the microscope and study them. The labs would have customers wanting to get an idea of, is iron better or steel better, or what about nickel or beryllium or all these other exotic metals, and they did testing on them. And she got to start working on equipment that had it not been World War II, and had she just been a woman, that job would have never opened up to her. She didn't have a college degree, and she was a woman, so it just would have never been on the table. But, and she obviously, again, with this ability to be very smart, and have a high IQ, or what appeared to be a high IQ, she really was well adapted to it, learned quickly, wrote clear and concise reports, learned how to use all sorts of, difficult equipment, lathes and other types of machines, and you know, she had 3 or 4 jobs during World War II. Each one she got better. She went to a different lab, and she really got quite skilled and learned a lot. The thing was is that the older men that weren't going off to war because they were too old, you know, treated her well. They treated her like the intern or the apprentice. They treated her well once they knew that she was going to be there, because there were a lot of women. But she was one of the only women that was doing the scientific work and not the clerical work. So they liked her. They thought she had some moxie, and really took her under their wing. And as a beneficiary of that, she learned a lot more about how labs worked. So after World War II, aid comes back, no trouble there. She talks herself into a job at International Harvester, which is a big farm implement company. They're building a new research center outside of Chicago, and she basically got the name of the guy who was running it from a friend, and just called him and said, you know, I want to come work for you. And he did the interview with her, I think more probably out of curiosity than anything else. And you know, he asked her a lot of questions, and he made it very clear, you don't have a degree, you're a woman, all the men are coming back from the war and expecting their jobs back, so, you know, tell me why I should hire you. And, you know, she was pretty good about explaining the things that she had learned. And I think something about it told him that I got to take a chance on her. So they hired her. This is 1948. That same year, that same year they started looking for cabins again, because it's after World War II. They both double income, no kids, you know, and they're driving again around northern Wisconsin, and somebody tells them to go up to northern Minnesota, that they might have more luck there. So they do. They ended up going to Grand Marais, and then the rangers at Grand Marais said you should go up the Gunflint Trail, and there might be something there. So they did. They ended up driving all the way up, and back in 1948, the Gunflint Trail isn't like it is today. So it was like a single lane, and for the most part, dirt road. It was blacktop to about where the trail center is now, but after that, it was pretty much still gravel. So they made it, and they landed at Gunflint Lodge, where Justine Kerfoot happened to be working. We all know her, or if you know that area, you know about Justine. She's a legend of Gunflint Lake, and has written several books herself about being up in northern Minnesota. But she directed them to a cabin that she knew was for sale. Probably I don't want to say out of spite, but being that they were both from Chicago and didn't seem to really have the bearings about them about the North Woods, you know, she thought, well, here's a couple of suckers that might want to buy Walt's cabin down the way. So they went down to this guy, Walt Yoakum, and knocked on his door, and it was a beautiful setting. It had the trees there were old growth pines, so it was checking all the boxes for the Hoovers. And they bought the place. They ended up buying it. Like, you know, they looked it over, they thought about it overnight, they called them the next day, and they closed on it. And they really, I think, you know, were overly enthusiastic about buying it, and didn't realize what they were getting into. Plus, there are a couple from Chicago that really, you know, hadn't ever lived in the North Woods or stayed in the North Woods much. So fast forward a little, or let me take a parallel track here. So Helen's at International Harvester. She's working in a couple of different departments. She finally gets in the metallurgy department, which is what she had been doing at all these other lab jobs. And she's having a hard time. Big company, men are being sexist about her and giving her a lot of things to do that she necessarily didn't have to, but they're just making life miserable for her. So they give her this one project that they've been trying to figure out for 50 years, and it was the discs on a disc harrow. It's a piece of farm equipment that you haul behind a tractor, and it tills the field. And what happens is that there's rocks, there's clay, there's stumps, there's other things that get in the way, and they break the discs. And this is a problem, and it's been a problem for 50 years. And they've been trying to figure it out, and they haven't been successful. Tried several different ways of thinking it through. They could, of course, change steel and add nickel or some other precious metals to it to make it stronger, but then it's really expensive, and then they don't make any money. So Helen, you know, got this project, and she started to think about it differently. After the war and some of her previous lab jobs, she had talked to researchers in France. She was talking with U.S. Steel about tests that they were doing on steel. The U.S. Navy was doing a bunch of research on battleships that had been, hit in World War II, and they wanted to kind of assess, from torpedo shellings and things like that, what was it that caused the metal to break down. So there was a lot of research going on to make metal better. And of course, this post-World War II sort of industrial revolution, there was just a lot happening. So Helen figures out this problem. She solves it. I talk about it in the book, and it gets real complicated. But essentially, when you heat steel to a certain temperature, and then you need to do something to it so that it hardens. And she suggested that using a salt bath was going to be better than what they were using. And the salt bath would hold the temperature of the steel longer, and then it would harden. So she figured that out. She did testing on it for 2 years in the field, and she found out that solved the problem. And she got 2 patents for it. And International Harvester was like over the top crazy that she had solved this problem. And of course, if you were in her shoes, you'd probably have the pick of any research job that you'd want. So hold that thought right there. We're going to go back a little bit to another. So 1953, Helen's working on this project, almost has it done. Her mother dies. And in the 6 years that they owned this cabin, Helen and Adrian had been going up there every summer for their 2-week vacation and trying to do things on the cabin, not having much success because they'd have to set up things and try to re-roof and do all these projects that really didn't allow them to enjoy the cabin. So one of the neighbors said, you guys are up here working too hard, and you should spend more time enjoying yourself. And by the way, the cabin next to yours is for sale, and you can afford it, and it's a summer cabin. It wasn't year-round. And that way you have a place to live and enjoy, and then you can work on this cabin and fix it up. So they did. They had enough money that they could buy this cabin. This is 1953. Her mother dies in 1953. She finishes her project in 1954. So Helen's kicking around thinking, okay, what's going to be my next gig with Harvester? And Abe had gotten ill. He smoked a lot, so he had some early emphysema and had a throat surgery that was not healing well, and it was making Helen quite irritated that he was suffering. And she petitioned the company for a year off to live at the cabin and nurse him back to health, and they said, no way, you're not getting a year. So they settled on 2 months. So summer of 54, they moved there, and or they go up there, and Abe gets totally healthy. The air is clean up there. It's not Chicago. I'm going to read you, non-fiction books are not great to read from because they're not terrible. It's not like a novel. So, but I am going to read this short prologue that'll kind of set the stage for the next part. The drive down the Gunflint Trail was a quiet, almost somber affair. After 2 months of peace, quiet, fresh air, and excitement about the future improvements they planned for their simple log cabin in the woods, the thought of a 12-plus-hour drive back to Chicago was bittersweet. Abe and Helen Hoover had arrived in late July 1954 at the height of summer's curative powers. Warm temperatures, quiet breezes, and a sun that still hung high in the sky. The cabin, nestled in the tall virgin pines on Gunflint Lake, had provided the relief Helen hoped would get her ailing husband Abe back to health after a slow recovery from surgery. Neither one talked much as the car wound its way toward Grand Marais, and neither one was looking forward to returning to work. Helen had been able to get a 2-month leave of absence from her metallurgy job after successfully completing a large project. She had asked for more time, claiming her husband could use it convalescing in the North Woods, but was denied. Abe had been on extended medical leave from a textbook publisher where he was an art director. Helen's mother, who lived with them, had just died the year before, so nothing was keeping them in Chicago. Helen broke the silence. She started offering reasons they should quit their jobs and move to the cabin. The year before, they had bought a second cabin next door, so now they had room for their furniture, clothing, and other household items. Helen wasn't tied to her job with the project behind her, and Abe had been on leave from his job for some time. Plus, from the time she was a young girl, she had envisioned a day when she would live somewhere in the North Woods and write. As Helen built her argument, Abe began coming around to the idea, but he still felt they needed more time for planning and to think through the financial ramifications. But Helen thought those justifications were only delaying the inevitable. He could do freelance artwork like he had done at home. Helen thought she could try her hand at writing, something she had put off for years as she focused on her career. Her enthusiasm for their collective ability to make the change started to work on Abe, and he too saw that if they didn't do it now, they would only be older and less able to make the move later. Once they arrived in Grand Marais, Aide drove to the local telephone exchange building where they could place a long-distance call. Helen retrieved her address book from her purse and dialed her boss in Chicago. "Mac, I guess I'm calling to say goodbye," she said. And with that, Helen resigned her position at the farm implement company. Now she and Aide would pack their apartment in Chicago and get their personal belongings, move to Gunflint Lake, starting a new chapter in their life. While they did not have a solid plan, Helen knew that something would turn up. So, they indeed went back to Chicago and packed everything up, including things as silly as their telephone books. I mean, everything was packed. And it came up on a semi which unloaded everything, and they had stuff everywhere, and including a baby grand piano. So they had all this stuff that they really hadn't done a very good job at deciding what should stay and what should go. But they had moved in, and this is in the fall of 1954. And the thing that was interesting about it is, first of all, they had to figure out how to make a living. Yes, Aide could do some freelance artwork, and they decided also that he could do stationery notepaper, like with animals and things on it that he could see and draw from. And they turned that into a little mail order business. They sold to resorts and gift shops up and down on Highway 61. They had friends in Chicago who bought that. Helen decided one day, after spending some time up at either Gunflint Lodge or Heston's Lodge, there's two of them that she spent time at and knew the owners, was looking at nature magazines that they had in the lobby, and she saw that they had, the Audubon magazine in particular, had classified ads for people selling things. So she said, we could run a little classified ad about your nature stationery, and they did quite well with that. They got a lot of national business from that, and even went so far as to create catalogs every year with new designs and things like this. And but when they moved in, they had no running water. They had intermittent electricity from an electric plant that kind of worked, a wind electric plant that kind of worked and didn't, and no indoor plumbing. They had just the outdoor privy, and they had that for 13 years. So they had a pretty rough, and they were used to that in the summertime, but now they're going to live here year-round, and they had given no thought to what it was going to be like living there when it's 40 below in the middle of winter with no running water. And you have to go to the lake every day to get it out with a bucket. So they were dreamers on one level, to say the least. But anyway, Helen decides too that she's reading these nature magazines. She goes, I can write like this, I can do this. And she started to write. She started to observe the animals around her. Here's the scientist in Helen coming out. And she's very good at writing reports, so she can write things in a way that, they aren't scientific, but that regular lay people can understand. And she starts to submit them to magazines, and she gets very good response, and she starts selling to Audubon and Nature and Frontiers and Defenders of Wildlife News and a few other assorted odd magazines, and she starts making $35, $50 a pop for these things. And she also ends up getting connected with the editor of Humpty Dumpty's magazine. How many of you remember that when you were kids? So, and they liked her writing immediately. I think the editor was more interested in her as a curiosity. His name was Alvin Trussell. He was a well-known children's author himself. I had won I think a Newbery Prize for a book he wrote. But he was really curious about this intellectual woman from Chicago who just walked away from her career and went into live in the woods and supposedly write. So they had a really interesting intellectual back and forth, and but he gave her a monthly column to write a monthly nature column for kids, and came out 10 times a year and paid $30. So again, there's more income coming in here. So all this, writing here, connecting with editors here, leads to one of her articles getting reprinted in a book, and the publisher reached out to her and said, how would you like to write a book on nature and the things that you see in your yard? And she had thought about it, but she didn't think she was ready, but she took the contract, and she wrote her first book called The Long Shadowed Forest. It came out in 1963. I'm sure there's one here somewhere, if you want to buy it. It's an interesting book. Aide did all the illustrations, all these little pen and ink illustrations of animals. It was very it was well received. It got some national publicity. It was a little slow to sell right before the holidays, and the printer had to go back and reprint right before Christmas, which made Helen really irritated her because she knew that they were missing a lot of sales by not getting it in the pipeline soon enough. So, and then a year later, one thing that kind of helped her a lot in 1964 is Harrison Salisbury, famous New York Times correspondent. At that time, he was covering Vietnam and was getting into a lot of trouble with the Johnson administration for his writing about the war and how it wasn't going well. And he was a Minnesota native, for those of you maybe who know him. And he had somehow crossed paths with Helen, either through her nature writing, but he wrote this long column in the New York Times on the op-ed page on Christmas Eve, 1964, and and it was well received, and obviously it was well read, and it sold another couple thousand books because it was Harrison Salisbury putting his stamp of approval on it. So all during these years, while they lived up at Gunflint Lake, they also fed animals, birds and things like that. But one Christmas in the late 1950s, there was a deer that came into their yard that was starving a buck. And one of the trapper friends that they had was over for a holiday meal, and he said that's really unusual for a buck to come into the yard when it's in that much. It must be in really distressed because it wouldn't come around humans. So they start to feed that deer the next day, and then lead to its getting its health back, and then they just continue to feed deer over the next several years. And Helen is thrilled with this because she loves the deer, she loves watching them, she loves the doe that comes each spring, and there's been a couple of years in a row where the doe has the fawns in their yard somewhere so that they're nearby, and Helen can observe and watch this. And it was a really idyllic sort of 2 or 3 years until word got out to the hunting community that the Hoovers were feeding all these deer and fattening them up, and so deer hunters sort of came in and took a lot of the deer, which really distressed Helen. And of course, you're living in northern Minnesota and you're feeding deer, there's going to be trouble. It's not going to have a good ending, even in the 1950s. So so that whole episode, was sort of the highlight of her time on Gunflint Lake, but it was also sort of the beginning of too much development and too much change. And not only was it the deer and the hunting, but it was the roads getting widened and the use of DDT to spray the weeds down on the side roads, which made her crazy. And just the whole, all the things that come with increased development. They brought in power, the telephone lines were coming in. Up until the mid-50s, most of the resorts ran off generators that ran all day, and then at night they shut them off, and there was no electricity. So to have power come in was a big deal for the resorts, and even some of the cabin owners. But for the Hoovers, they said, no, we don't want power, because we don't want you cutting down 200 feet worth of trees just to run the line into our cabins. So they were different people. They were, they had their own way of approaching things. So after the long shadowed forest, she wanted to do this book about the deer, and it's called The Gift of the Deer. And it was a labor of love and sadness for her because it's centered around this buck named Peter. And at the end of the book, after some of the deer live, some of them are killed, Peter is shot by one of the neighbors, sort of out of spite, out of season, not for deer meat, not hunted. It was just left on Gunflint Lake, dead. And Helen found out later who did it, although in all of my research I can't find out who it was. She took that to her grave, but she said to her agent in a letter, she said, I know who did it. And she said, and I howled to the moon when I learned who it was. I thought that was interesting. And she said, I never told my husband who it was because she said I didn't know how he'd react. So I don't think her husband ever knew, unless maybe after they moved away, but he never knew who killed Peter. So that was sort of the capstone on those sort of idyllic years, and Helen wanted to capture that in a book. So she did that in The Gift of the Deer. It came out in 1966, and it was a huge bestseller. To get from there, I'm just going to do a little bit of inside publishing story. She was somewhat happy with the first book. This is an example of how she was sort of testy. She was very meticulous about her research on all the animals and things she wrote. I mean, she wrote what she observed, but she also got reference books and cross-checked her work and talked to experts and wrote letters to the University of Minnesota and all these experts. Pettengill at Cornell, who was the foremost bird authority in the 1960s. So she's talking to all these experts, and when the book is going through editing with that first publisher, they start questioning things like, I don't think squirrels can swim. And like Helen goes, I've seen squirrels swim. I mean, they don't intentionally swim, but I saw one fall off a tree into the water and it swam. And she got into all these like fights with her copy editor about things. So she did not want this next book, which was the most important book to her, to be published by them. So she was lamenting, how am I going to get my book published? I don't want them to do it. Got to get out of my contract, which she did. And then she writes to a woman named Gladys Tabor, who was like the Martha Stewart of the 1960s. She wrote a Family Circle column every month that was read by 3 million women. And Gladys had loved Helen's first book, told Helen she was a really good writer, she shouldn't be, agonizing so much. So she said, call my agent. So I'll give you her name and address. So she did. She sent a letter off to this woman named Carol Brandt, who happened to be one of the best literary agents of the 1960s. And her husband had been before, her husband before had been, was a generation older, had a lot of older clients, but between the two of them, they were a very well-respected literary agency. It turns out that Alfred Knopf, very esteemed publisher, this publishing house that has his name still is a very well-regarded publishing house. And he had read some of Helen's magazine work and had wanted them to do a book, but got to her too late because she had already signed the contract for the first book. So Carol Brandt and Alfred Knopf are good friends, and Carol sends it off to Alfred. Alfred remembers Helen and takes a look at it, sends it to his Nature editor, a guy named Angus Cameron, who's a very well-known editor, Sigurd Olson's editor, and they take the book. I mean, they just say it's practically perfect. We're going to take it. So they take the book. Of course, Knopf, being a big New York publisher, puts a lot behind it. It's an immediate bestseller. Sells about 50,000 copies. It gets Helen very famous and well off. And then another little thing happens that her agent engineered. Some of you remember Reader's Digest condensed books back in the, so a lot of head nods. So Reader's Digest would do this subscription service where they'd quarterly publish like 4 bestsellers in a condensed version. And they liked Helen's book. Carol Brandt had shared it with them. They liked it so much that they put it in their next one, even before they knew it was a bestseller. So it got that as well as the Knopf as well as the Reader's Digest. And they paid her $20,000 for that, which is a lot of money in 1960. So that took off, became a huge bestseller. And then, of course, the downside of success and fame is people coming to see you at your cabin to sign your books. And it was a constant stream of people. She wrote to her agent one day that from May to September, they had 176 people drop in on them, just like unannounced, without even writing ahead or trying to call or get word to them that they were coming. They just showed up with books in hand, expecting her to drop everything. And at this point, she's trying to get a third book done, a second book done for Knopf, because publishers, being publishers, once there's a hit, they want another book right away. And she couldn't get it done. She's frustrated with it. She ends up deciding that it's going to be a book about the first couple of years that they looked for a cabin and then found the cabin and then tried to adapt to living, which was really hilarious because they didn't know what they were doing. So she's writing that book, and she ends up having to leave to go to other places to finish it because she can't concentrate. Again, this is where her intelligence, high IQ really came into play. One of the things that I learned about her writing style is that she had to frame the whole book in her mind, in an outline form, and think about how she was going to write about it. And then once she got to that point, which took a long time for her, she would sit at the typewriter and it would just come out, the whole book. So and if she got interrupted, then she'd have to stop. She'd get angry, whoever interrupted her, and then she would have to reframe in her mind exactly where she needed to pick up and start writing again. So the fame was another part, and the drop-ins and the people was another part of the frustrations with things that changed for them while they were living on Gunflint Lake. So by this time, it's like 1969. Reader's Digest takes that second book. They pay him $25,000. That's a Place in the Woods. That doesn't sell quite as good as The Gift of the Deer, but it's still 30,000 or 40,000 copies, which is huge for a nature book. And then she wrote, then they finally got to the point where they needed to do some traveling. So they finally bought a car, and they finally traveled to the Southwest, came back, and decided that they needed to move away. It was just too difficult for her to stay there. It was frustrating, and it just made her sad that there was so much change. So they moved to New Mexico in 1971. They eventually had to move to Laramie, Wyoming, because when they were in New Mexico, she started to collect stray cats, and that created a problem in Rancho Stathouse where they lived. In fact, one of the things that I learned when I was doing the research in the book is I found a lot of correspondence that Helen had with people. And of course, being that she died in 1984 and wrote way back then, there's not a lot of people around that are still that I could talk to. But I tracked one guy down who's here tonight. His name is Gary Brown, and he had written to Helen when he was in college. And he went. The only thing I knew is he wrote on these little note paper that was from South Dakota School of Mines, where he went to school. So I tracked him down to their alumni office. This is what you do when you're a researcher. You get creative about finding people. And he actually wrote me back, and 2 years ago we had lunch, and he shared with me a bunch of the other correspondence that wasn't in Helen's files, and I'd really got a nice insight into Helen. And Gary's one of the few people I know that actually met Helen and visited her in New Mexico. So there's not a lot of people out there that actually, except for a few people up on the trail that owned resorts, that I was able to talk to that knew her. So it was really sort of a godsend that I found Gary one day, and we had a great time talking about Helen and his observations. So they ended up in Laramie with all these cats, and Helen, after the books in the North Woods really was done, she couldn't sort of get her mojo on writing anything else. She just wasn't living in the woods anymore, so she didn't feel it was honest to write about the woods. So she spent the last few years she's working on a memoir that never really went anywhere, and her agent and publisher had encouraged her to do it, but when they saw the product of what she was writing, they just said it wasn't good. And I've read it. I mean, it's not like her other writing. It seemed to be more of like a diary, a reminiscence, if you will. So it wasn't really well articulated. So anyway, she ended up dying in Laramie in 1984, and her husband died a couple of years later. And they had quite an interesting run on Gunflint Lake, and probably not as satisfying a life after they were in the North Woods, but still they carved out an existence. So let's talk about Helen's legacy for a moment. I mean, the fact that she was this trailblazing metallurgist is one of the things that I think is terrible that's been overlooked about her career. It's sort of, it's a footnote on author's notes about her, but she really solved a serious industrial problem for her employer, and I think she should get a lot of credit for that. And then I think the other thing that comes through all of her writing, and that I tried to pick up on, was that man can't control nature. He has to live in balance with it, and it's a message that is as timeless today as it was when she wrote it, and probably more so now. So I think that's an important takeaway. And what I mentioned earlier is that all of her books are still available and in print, so you can enjoy them still. And again, getting back to nature writing being timeless, you can pick up any of her books, and you'll find that they're a joy to read, and I think you will enjoy them. So with that, I am done, and I can take any questions if anybody's got any. So yes.
What tripped you onto her in the first place? What got you excited to write about her?
So my wife and I were looking for a cabin, and we had some good friends that had a cabin because we used to crash at their place a lot, and maybe they gave us the book to motivate us to get our own place. But anyway, they gave us the book because we were on this cabin journey, and this book, A Place in the Woods, is really about people who have this dream of getting a cabin, and then they buy it, and then they realize, oh my God, what have I gotten into? It's like the old adage of buying a boat. The best day you buy a boat is the day you buy it, and the best day you buy a boat is the day you sell it. So it's sort of that sort of mindset. So I was fascinated. I mean, it was a well-written book, and I just thought, well, she's written other books. I think I'll read them. Again, thanks to the University of Minnesota, they were all easy to find. And then I kind of got obsessive about it because I liked all the books. I thought, well, she must have a biography somewhere, and she didn't. And I had just read Sigurd Olsson's biography. I think this is like the mid-2000s. And I did find at the Minnesota History Center a very short paper that a woman at Hamlin that was in her 60s going for her MFA in fine arts had written, she had done some preliminary research, or had done a lot of research on Helen, and had written a paper for her master's thesis. And that's, when I found that document, I learned that all of Helen's papers were up at the University of Minnesota Duluth. So I just like sent off a note to UMD and said, who has access, can I get in there? And you can, and or I did, and then when I just saw all the fascinating materials that were there, I just thought, I got to tell this story. So that was on and off while I was working full time. But right before COVID, the University of Minnesota Press called me and said that, I heard you're writing a biography of Helen Hoover, which, I'd sort of put that out there. But at that point, it looked like I was going to have to self-publish, and that to me is a kiss of death for a biography. It's very hard. It's difficult to do. It's expensive, and the quality of, you have to hire editors and proofreaders and people if you want it to look decent. So I had, toyed with it, but I really wanted a real publisher, and they were like the perfect publisher because they'd republished her books, they'd published Sigurd Olson's biography. It was just like, so I met with my editor, Christian Tveiten, like a week before everything shut down from COVID. And I made a proposal, and I officially got the contract in June of 2020. No libraries were open for 2 years, so I was doing a lot of research by phone and by email. And fortunately, the byproduct of that is a lot of those libraries wouldn't be very helpful normally because they would want you to come and visit or hire a proxy researcher, but because they had all this staff that didn't have enough to do, they were like helping me. So we got a lot done by email for 2 years, and then I got to go up to UMD and spend I was up there probably at least 20 times in 2.5 years. Spent a lot of time in Duluth going through things. So that's the long answer. So thank you. Yes, sir.
Is their cabin still there?
The summer cabin was raised about 20 years ago, 15 years ago.
Did you?
The winter cabin is there, but it's been very much modified and modernized, so you really can't really tell much, and it's privately owned. So I've been in it. Doesn't look anything like probably what I've seen from pictures. So
There was an inside toilet?
there's indoor plumbing now. Not then.
Not that.
So the Hoovers never had indoor plumbing. I think at the end they had a chemical toilet for like a year. Yeah, it was one of the first prototype chemical. Yes, Shelley.
And she never went back.
I'm glad you brought that up. A couple of her books she talks about sort of being wistful about it. She kept telling everybody in correspondence right up until like maybe 3 years before she died that she and Aid were coming back to get things out of the cabin because they'd still owned the old cabin. They hadn't sold it, and she did not. I don't think she could bring herself to come back and see it. She does in one of her books talk about coming back and being really disappointed, but she kind of then comes to terms with it, and that's the end of that particular book, the last book. But that was 1971, and they kept telling people they were coming back, and they never did. Never did. Which is really sad. I mean, it's kind of an interesting capstone to the whole life because it kind of makes you realize that you're only going to get something for so long, and it's not going to last forever. So, yeah. Anybody else? All right. Well, Leva.
What's your next?
What's my next one? Kim, can I write another
Can
book?
I talk to you about that?
My wife has other plans.
Yes, 2 things to do on his honey-do list. Then he can write the next one.
We're talking, there's a lot of Helen's magazine writing that's out there, and we're thinking about possibly doing something with that. In fact, I just heard from my editor this week about that. Is he here? He was going to come. I don't think so. I didn't see him. So we were talking about that. So that because it's interesting. It's good writing. Some of it was found in different versions in her books, but when they stand alone, they're really interesting. And there's several pieces where she really is more of an environmentalist and advocate. There's one that she really goes after deer hunters in a really blistering way, which she would never do in her books because she didn't want to irritate any of her readers. And then she also was quite outspoken about the use of DDT, and she got entangled with federal and state conservation people all the time about that. She just went after them. And then she was also anti-development. They were trying to, in the late 50s, they were trying to open a new border crossing the east end of Gunflint Lake into Canada to bypass, so they could somehow route all the traffic from Grand Marais up the trail and into Canada instead of going to Grand Portage, which is stupid. None of the resorts wanted it; they hated the idea of it. So she was involved in that, and she got Sig Olson involved in that, so it was very interesting. Sue, back there.
Tell us a little bit more about her children's books. Were they successful also, and how did she know how to write for children?
That's very interesting. Thanks for asking about the children's books, because I kind of gave that short shrift. Two of the books were compilations of her columns from her nature, and they were published by Parents Magazine Press. And in fact, Elvin Tresselt, her editor, again, I told you he was fascinated with her. He arranged to come out and organize the one that they were going to make the choices about it, but he wanted to do it at the cabin in Gunflint. So he came out in June of '65, and he stayed in the summer house by, he had that to himself, because at that time they were in the other cabin in the summer. And Helen played him a Beethoven minuet on her baby grand, and he had a bear try to come through the door while he was there. And he wrote all about this in an editor's note a couple of months later. But the one book that she had written early on was kind of a parable called The Great Wolf and the Good Woodsman. And it's just kind of a kid's story about how it's based on this old myth that on Christmas Day animals can talk to each other. And then so this woodsman falls in his cabin and breaks his ankle, and he can't get up, and if he doesn't tend to his fire, he's going to freeze and die. So the animals all talk amongst each other because he feeds them, and the animals talk to the wolf and say, "Wolf, you need to go get the other guy, the other cabin owner, to come over and rescue this guy." So it's all very beautiful and fun. I mean, it's whimsical. It was published by Parents Magazine Press as well. It was very successful. It won a lot of awards for illustration. And then the University of Minnesota Press did republish that in 2005, and they had Betsy Bowen from Grand Marais do the woodcuts for that, and it's a beautiful book. It's probably here somewhere. So it's a beautiful book, definitely worth looking at. So her children's books, they sold like 50,000 copies, but the royalty payments on those were like a nickel. So she didn't make any money, but she said to her editor at Knopf, she said, "I do the children's stuff because," she said, "the parents are reading it to the kids, and if they know that I'm a nature writer, they'll buy my books." So she was strategic in thinking about some things like that. So she didn't really want to do the kids. And the other thing too is she was The Gift of the Deer ended up being a surprise hit book for middle school kids, and she didn't expect that. I mean, she was thrilled. She didn't expect that, and they came. She would get lots of letters from teachers and kids that they'd done a project reading The Gift of the Deer. So that really meant a lot to her, because reaching children was really important to her, because she used her position to get some propaganda in there about nature and conservation and ecology. So she was smart enough to know that she had an audience to influence. So, but thank you for asking about the kids stuff. All right, we're almost right at the top, so it hasn't gone long. Well, you've all been wonderfully attentive and asked great questions. I really thank you for turning out and supporting me. And I'll be here for a while if you want books signed or whatever.